All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we are going deep, deep, deep into a proposed law, one that's been causing a lot of buzz out there. It's called the SVE Act, short for Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, and it's all about changing how we register to vote in federal elections. We're going right to the source here, folks. We're talking H.R. 8281, the actual bill introduced in the House of Representatives, no interpretations, no summaries, just the raw deal.
Yeah, it's really interesting how this bill tackles voter registration. It actually goes back and wants to change the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. Basically, the big idea is making proof of U.S. citizenship a must-have to register to vote in federal elections.
Okay, so let's cut to the chase here. What kind of proof are we talking about? What do people actually need to show?
Well, the bill has a whole list of documents that would work. The usual suspects, your driver's license, passport, stuff like that. But then it gets a little more, well, interesting. You see things like a U.S. military ID, but it has to have a service record showing you were born in the U.S., or even an American Indian card, but it has to have the classification KIC on it.
KIC. That's a new one on me, I got to be honest.
Right. That's where you see them trying to be super thorough, like they thought of everything. KIC on an American Indian card, it means you're a recognized member of a federally recognized tribe. So they're trying to cover all the bases, making sure they're not leaving anyone out.
I see. It really shows how deep they went into this. But what about if you can't find your documents right away? Like, your passport expired or something. Does that mean you can't register?
Not necessarily, no. The bill does have a plan for that. You can sign something called an attestation, basically swearing under oath that you're a U.S. citizen. Then it's up to the state and local officials to figure out if you're really a citizen based on what you tell them.
So, like, a pinky swear and Uncle Sam, but way more serious. But doesn't that open up a whole can of worms? How do you even check if someone's telling the truth?
That's one of the big questions about this bill. I mean, yeah, they want to make it easier with a standard form everyone uses, but critics say relying on these pinky swears, well, it could lead to fraud, and it might be hard to actually check if it's true.
Right, right. And even beyond the practical stuff, it seems like just having to swear like that could make people nervous, Like they might not even bother registering at all.
Yeah, I can see that. Some people are worried it could discourage folks from registering, especially those who already have a hard time voting. Imagine if you're a new citizen, you might be scared to go through all this, or worry about what could happen even if you are eligible.
It's like they're trying to stop fraud, but might end up stopping people who are allowed to vote from voting.
Right. It's a tough balance. They want secure elections, but they don't want to make it harder for people to vote.
Sure.
And the bill actually gives a specific job to the Election Assistance Commission, They're supposed to figure out how to make all this work without messing things up.
Wow, that's a lot of responsibility, huh? Like, here's the law, now you make sure it's fair. What exactly are they supposed to do?
Well, a few things. Remember that standard form we talked about? The one for people who can't show their documents right away. They need to create that, make sure it's the same in every state. Plus, they have to make sure it's accessible for people with disabilities.
So they know some people might have trouble with all this, and they're trying to fix it beforehand.
Yeah, exactly.
Still, it seems like there are a lot of unknowns. Will this really work how they think it will?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And that's where things get really interesting, because now we're not just talking about how the bill works, we're talking about what it means for voters.
Okay, let's talk about that. People who like the bill say it's super important for stopping voter fraud, but how big of a problem is that, really?
Well, that's where things get tricky. See, the SAVE Act taps into this fear people have about elections, The idea that people who aren't citizens are voting, even though study after study shows that in-person voter fraud is super rare.
So it's more about addressing a fear than
Yeah.
an actual problem. But, I mean, even if it's not a huge problem, couldn't you say this just adds an extra layer of security? Isn't that a good thing?
That's a fair point, and it's what a lot of people who support the bill say. They say that even one case of fraud is too many. It makes people lose faith in the system. But the people against it, well, they say it'll cause more problems than it solves.
Like what kind of problems?
Well, there's the practical stuff, like how much it'll cost to put this into action. Think about it. Election officials would have to check every single voter's citizenship. That's a lot of work, especially in states with tons of people.
Yeah, I can imagine the lines at the polls if everyone has to dig out all these documents.
Exactly. People might just give up and not vote at all. Plus, there's the money. New forms, training poll workers, all these new systems, it adds up fast. And what about mistakes? What if someone loses their ID or there's a typo on it? That could stop someone from voting even if they're allowed.
Yeah, that makes sense. But beyond all that, there's the whole question of whether this is fair to everyone.
Right. Civil rights groups and people who fight for voting rights, they've been really loud about this. They say making people show specific IDs will hurt certain groups more than others. People of color, low-income folks, senior citizens, they already have a hard time voting. This could make it even worse.
It's like trying to do something good but accidentally making things worse for the people you're trying to help.
Yeah, you could say that. And that's why the bill has that part where the Election Assistance Commission is supposed to come up with rules and help people. It's an attempt to make sure it doesn't hurt anyone.
So they're aware of these problems and they're trying to stop them before they happen. But it still feels like we're walking into the unknown here. No one really knows how this is going to play out.
That's true, and that's what makes this whole thing so interesting. It's not just about the law itself, it's about what it says about voting rights in America. It's like looking at a tiny piece of a much bigger puzzle.
A puzzle about who gets to vote, how we make sure our elections are fair, and what it even means to be an American.
Exactly.
It's a big deal.
It is, and that's why we're talking about it today.
Well, we've covered a lot, haven't we? We talked about what's in the bill, the arguments for and against it, and how it could affect voters. But the big question remains, will this thing actually become a law?
That's a tough one, and honestly, things get even more complicated from here. As of right now, July 23rd, 2024, the SAVE Act is just sitting in the Senate waiting for someone to talk about it and vote on it. But knowing how things are in politics right now, it's hard to say what will happen.
So what's going on behind the scenes? What do we need to know to figure out if it'll pass?
Well, voter registration and election integrity, those are hot topics right now. People get really fired up about them. And this bill could affect so many voters that I think it's going to face a lot of pushback, especially from people who see it as a way to make it harder to vote.
So it's not just about whether the bill is good or bad. It's about politics, too. Who wants it? Who doesn't want it? And is there any way they can meet in the middle?
Exactly. It's like a chess game, figuring out who's making which moves. If we want to know what will happen, we got to look beyond the bill itself and see what's going on in the world of politics.
So it's not just about the words on paper. It's about everything else going on around it.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so fascinating. We're not just learning about the SAVE Act. We're learning about how our government actually works.
How laws get made and how we can be a part of it all.
You got it.
So even if this bill doesn't become a law, talking about it is still important.
Absolutely. It makes us think about big questions. Who gets to vote? How do we make sure our elections are fair? What does it mean to be an American?
Questions that we'll be wrestling with for a long time.
For sure.
All right, well, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive. But before we go, I want to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. We've been focused on the SAVE Act, but what does this bill tell us about America right now?
You know, that's a question that's going to keep a lot of smart people busy for years to come.
Yeah.
The SAVE Act, in a way, it's like a mirror showing us what's going on in our democracy.
Okay, I like that, the mirror analogy. Tell me more.
We're living in a time where everyone's divided. It's deeper than just Democrats and Republicans. It's like we're fighting about who belongs here, who gets to decide what happens next.
And the SAVE Act is adding fuel to that fire.
In a way, yeah. I don't know if it's on purpose or not, but the bill brings up all these worries about who's a real American, worries about how the country is changing and if our elections are even real.
So it's like the bill itself is a sign of how uneasy everyone is.
I think you're right. And remember, this isn't new. These fights about voting rights have been going on forever. Throughout American history, people have tried to stop others from voting because of their race, their gender, how much money they have, even if they could read.
So this is just another chapter in a long story, a story about all these fears and anxieties you're talking about.
Exactly. But what's different now is how fast information spreads. Lies and rumors go viral in seconds, and no one trusts anyone anymore. Not the media, not the government.
Which means it's even more important to be careful about what we believe, to check the facts and talk to people who disagree with us.
I couldn't agree more. We can't let fear and division control us. We need to be honest about the problems facing our democracy and work together to find solutions that protect everyone's right to vote.
So what's the message for our listeners? What does all this mean for them?
Simple. Stay informed, stay involved, and stay aware. Read the news, learn about the issues, talk to your elected officials.
Don't let anyone tell you your vote doesn't matter. It's the most powerful thing you have.
It's true, and that's why this deep dive into the SAVE Act is so important. It's not just about this one bill, it's about understanding how our democracy works and how we can protect it.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the SAVE Act. Remember, staying informed is a lifelong thing. We're all in this together. And hey, who knows? Maybe this sparked something in you. Maybe you'll be the one writing the next big law.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this is where we get to the heart of the whole SAVE Act debate. It's not just about logistics. It's about finding that balance. We need secure elections, but we also need to make sure it doesn't hurt voters.
Okay, so let's talk about that impact then. The impact on voters. People who are for the bill say it's all about stopping voter fraud, but is that really a big problem?
Well, that's where things get interesting, right? The SAVE Act, it kind of feeds into this worry people have about elections, like this idea that people who aren't citizens are voting, even though there's not really much evidence of that. I mean, study after study shows that in-person voter fraud is super rare.
So it's more about fear than facts then. But even if it's not a huge problem, couldn't you argue that this is just an extra layer of protection? Like, why not be extra careful?
That's a valid point, and it's one that supporters bring up a lot. They say that even one case of fraud is too many. It undermines the whole system. But people who are against it, they say the costs outweigh the benefits.
Costs? What kind of costs?
Well, for one, think about all the work it would take to actually make this happen. Election officials would have to check every single voter's citizenship. Can you imagine? Especially in states with huge populations, that's a logistical nightmare.
Oh, yeah. The lines at the polls would be insane if everyone had to prove their citizenship.
Exactly, and people might just give up, decide it's not worth the hassle. And then there's the financial side of things, printing new forms, training poll workers, setting up new systems. It all adds up, not to mention the possibility of human error. What if someone loses their ID or there's a typo on it? That could prevent someone from voting, even if they're a citizen.
It seems like those practical concerns are a pretty big deal.
Oh.
But beyond that, there's the question of fairness, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Civil rights groups, people who fight for voting rights, they've been really vocal about this. They argue that these specific ID requirements, they could actually create a barrier for certain groups. We're talking about people of color, low-income folks, senior citizens, people who already face obstacles when it comes to voting.
It's like they're already facing an uphill battle, and this just adds another hurdle. It almost feels like a well-intentioned idea that could backfire and hurt the very people it's trying to help.
I think that's a good way to put it, yeah. And that's why the bill includes that section about the Election Assistance Commission. They're supposed to come up with guidelines and make sure it's accessible for everyone. It's an attempt to kind of soften the blow.
So they're aware of these potential problems and they're trying to be proactive.
Right, exactly.
But still, it seems like there are a lot of unknowns.
There are, definitely. And that's what makes this debate so interesting. It's not just about the technical details of the bill. It's about the bigger picture of voting rights in America, the SAVE Act. It's like a lens.
Yeah.
It helps us see these larger questions about access, equity, and the future of our democracy.
So it's like a microcosm of all these bigger societal debates. But let's go back to the bill itself for a second. We've talked about the potential downsides, but is there anything in the bill that tries to address those concerns, like about privacy or information being misused?
Actually, there is. There's a Section 5C2, to be exact, and it specifically says that the information gathered for citizenship verification can't be used for anything else. Like, it can't be used as evidence in criminal or immigration proceedings, unless, of course, it's related to a case where someone knowingly tried to register or vote illegally.
So they're trying to build in some safeguards, make sure the information is only used for voter registration.
Right, exactly. It's an attempt to address those concerns about chilling effects, particularly among immigrant communities. The idea is that if people know their information won't be used against them in other ways, they'll be more likely to register.
It's a balancing act, isn't it? Trying to ensure security without sacrificing accessibility.
It is. It really is.
But is it enough? Some people argue that even with these safeguards, there's still a risk of misuse.
That's a valid point, and it speaks to the larger anxieties we have about data privacy these days. It's not just about voter registration, it's about this growing feeling that our personal information is being collected and used in ways we don't fully understand or control.
That's a whole other conversation we could have, a deep dive into data privacy. But for now, let's stick with the SAVE Act. We've covered a lot of ground, the build provisions, the arguments for and against it, and the potential impact on voters. But the big question remains, will it actually become law?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. As of July 23rd, 2024, the ASV Act has been introduced in the Senate and placed on the calendar, which means it's just waiting to be debated and voted on. But given the current political climate, it's really hard to say what will happen.
So what are the factors at play here? What can help us understand the likelihood of this bill passing?
Voter registration and election integrity, those are hot button issues right now. There's a lot of passion on both sides. And the SAVE Act, with its potential to impact millions of voters, it's going to face some serious opposition, especially from those who see it as a threat to voting rights.
So it's not just about the bill itself. It's about the politics surrounding it. Who
Exactly.
supports it, who opposes it, and are there any compromises that could be made?
You got it. It's all part of the political chess game. To understand what might happen, we need to look beyond the bill itself and analyze the bigger political landscape.
So it's not just about the words on the page. It's about the context, the forces at play.
Exactly, and that's what makes this deep dive so valuable. It's not just about understanding the SAVE Act. It's about understanding how our political system works, how laws get made, and how we can be a part of that process.
So even if the SAVE Act doesn't become law, the conversation it sparked is still important.
Absolutely. It forces us to confront these fundamental questions about who gets to vote, how we ensure fair elections, and what it means to be a citizen in a democracy.
Questions that will continue to shape our political landscape for years to come.
No doubt about it.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Absolutely. It makes us think about the big questions, about who gets to vote, how we make sure our elections are fair, what it even means to be an American.
Yeah, those are questions we'll be dealing with for a long time.
Oh, for sure.
Well, with that in mind, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the SAVE Act. But before we go, I want to zoom out a little. We've been all up in the details of this bill, but what does it tell us about American democracy right now, like the big picture?
That's a question that could keep historians and political scientists busy for years, I bet. You see, the SAVE Act, it's kind of like a mirror reflecting all the challenges facing our democracy today.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this mirror idea.
Well, think about it. We're living in this time of crazy division, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just about political parties anymore. It's like a fundamental clash, a clash over who belongs here, who gets to have a say in our future.
And you're saying the SAVE Act is feeding into that.
Yeah, in a way, whether they meant to or not, the bill taps into these anxieties people have. Anxieties about who's a real American, about how the country is changing, about whether our elections are even legitimate.
It's like the bill itself is a symptom of this deeper unease in society.
That's a good way to put it. And it's important to remember that these debates about voting rights, they aren't new. Throughout American history, there have always been people trying to limit who can vote. Sometimes it was based on race, sometimes gender, sometimes how much money you had, even whether you could read.
So this is just the latest chapter in a long and complicated story, a story that reflects all these anxieties you're talking about.
Exactly. What's different now is how quickly information spreads. False information can go viral in seconds. And there's this growing distrust of everything, the media, the government, you name it.
Which means we have to be even more careful about what we believe, right? Double check everything, talk to people who see things differently.
Couldn't agree more. We can't let fear and division win. We need to have real, honest conversations about the problems facing our democracy. And we need to work together to find solutions that protect the right to vote for everyone who's eligible.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they do after listening to all this?
Stay informed, stay engaged, stay vigilant, read the news, research the issues, contact your representatives, make your voice heard.
Don't let anyone tell you your vote doesn't matter. It's the most powerful tool we have to shape our country.
That's right, and that's what makes this deep dive into the SAVE Act so important. It's not just about this one bill, it's about understanding how our democracy works and how we can protect it.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this episode of the Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of the SAVE Act. And remember, staying informed is a journey, not a destination. We're all in this together, and who knows, maybe this conversation sparks something in you. Maybe you'll be the one drafting the next big bill that changes the world. All right, that's it for us. See you next time.